Hello and welcome to My Victorian Nightmare. I'm your host, Genevieve Mannion, and I'm here to talk about mysterious deaths, morbid fascinations, disturbing stories, and otherwise spooky events from the Victorian era. Because to me, there's just something especially intriguing, creepy, and oddly comforting about horror and mayhem from the 19th century. So, listener discretion is advised. Hello, friends. Welcome to this, my 7th podcast. You guys, I asked if you could bring me to 20 ratings on Spotify last week, and I was afraid that I was being a little greedy. I was nervous that I wouldn't get any likes at all, but you brought me to 30. That's so sweet. I'm so grateful. I truly cherish every single one of those ratings. It really is an enchanting feeling to know that people are enjoying something that I love to share. So please, continue to rate the podcast on Spotify or wherever you find your spooky podcasts. It really helps me out, and above all, it encourages me to continue. So again, I really feel like I'm being greedy here, but can you bring me to 50 ratings on Spotify by the next episode? I'd probably cry, but I'll do it on my own time, alone in the dark, listening to Sisters of Mercy. But for real though, that will let me know that I'm still on the right track, so thank you for rating, and thank you for listening. Today's episode is going to be really fun. I'm going to have to do a few podcasts on this topic alone, because I feel like I just spent the last day falling down endless rabbit holes, slicked with ectoplasm. It's been a lot. Today, we're diving into the spine-tingling world of Victorian Spiritualism. We'll talk about where it all began, what a Victorian materializing seance would entail. We'll also certainly talk about the ways they'd trick people into believing they were talking to dead people, and we'll explore the history of the Ouija board. Before we get there, I promised you a review of the movie Death Tunnel in the last episode. You probably have not seen it. This movie is set in the Waverly Hills Sanatorium, where 63,000 people died of tuberculosis in the 1800s. I talked about tuberculosis sanatoriums in episode 6. The synopsis sounded pretty exciting, but it kind of has to be seen to be believed. I really applaud myself. I made it through a full 10 minutes. You can usually tell that if a movie's title sequence includes title animations, you can just drag and drop in After Effects. It's not going to be transcendent, particularly. Here's what you could expect within the first 10 minutes of Death Tunnel. This movie was made in 2005, so we have girls that are dressed like 2005 Britney Spears with 2005 Britney Spears hair, that are supposed to be in their 20s, but they all look like they're in their 40s. We have some gratuitous nudity in the first 5 minutes, light fixtures that inexplicably drip with ooze. We've got some dollar store nighties, and this sentence was said by a college professor: "I call tuberculosis the romantic disease because it took you when you were young and beautiful." No, it didn't. It killed everyone, young and old. It made them cough up blood, so yeah, very romantic. Don't watch this movie. Or absolutely watch it. Absolutely watch it, and then tell me how it turns out. I feel strangely invested in it now. Just not enough to watch the whole thing. Thanks. Before we begin, I want to note that my main resources were a SmithsonianMag.com article written by Karen Abbott, a Grunge.com article by Mina Elwell, a Ranker article by Liv Pescarelli, and a Daily Beast article by Tom Sykes. You'll find all of those and my other references in the show notes. While doing research for this episode, the amount of times that I read "you can't talk about Victorian spiritualism without mentioning this person, this facet, this event, this goop that came out of someone's private parts," for real, was just bewildering. So don't come at me if you hear this podcast and think, how could she not have mentioned X, Y, or Z? Actually, wait, no, I take that back. Absolutely come at me and tell me all the stuff that I didn't know about this topic so I can talk about it in another podcast, or any topic that you'd like to know more about regarding Victorian spookiness. If there's something that you'd like to hear, I'm always open to inspiration. So please email me at myvictoriannightmare@gmail.com, or leave a comment. If you're listening to this on YouTube, I get notifications for those comments. But let's jump as fully as we can into the topic at hand. For those of you who are unfamiliar, spiritualism doesn't just mean spirituality. We're not talking about Victorian religiosity in a broad sense. We're talking about a very specific religious movement. This movement was both a religious and social movement, and adherents believed that consciousness persists after death in spirit form in a spirit world, and that these spirits of the dead continue to evolve in intelligence and awareness. Most importantly, they believed that these spirits could be directly communicated with, and that they could share their superior knowledge of moral, ethical truths, as well as tell someone where Grandpa stashed his money, with the help of a psychic medium, someone, usually a woman, with a special connection to the spirit world. I have to admit, I'm a bit of a spiritualist myself. I don't not believe in ghosts. I don't not believe that energy cannot be created or destroyed. I talk to my dead relatives and friends all the time. They don't talk back, but they don't have to. I just want to send out that I'm thinking about them and hope that they know it somehow. That's just where I stand on the subject. And I have a confession to make. I actually have used a dog medium to talk to my very living Pomeranian Toby, and it was one of the most, I'm not even joking, incredible experiences of my life. I went into it for entertainment purposes only, and this woman who I never met, who had nothing but a photograph of my dog, knew everything. I mean everything about him. She even knew that I use small trays instead of a bowl to feed my dog, and that I separate his food into tiny little bites and garnish them with chopped vegetables. I call these his sushis. She even said, "There's 3, right? There are 3 different colors. Yeah, he loves this. Don't stop feeding him that way." There are so many layers and flavors of judgment that you must be experiencing after hearing that last paragraph, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave it there. I'm a believer, at least in dog psychics, and dead human psychics, I'm a bit more skeptical for the many reasons that we'll discuss today. But before we do, I want you to follow me through this large glass atrium here to this hallway over here. I want to show you something. It's 1861. It's midnight. This hallway is lit only by flickering lamplight. It's cold, it's dark, but you can see the intricate woodwork of wainscoting and eyes that seem to follow you in the paintings that line the walls. Don't worry about those guards at the door, they know you're with me. Right this way. We've come to a room lined with crimson silk, lit only with candles on a round table, reflected in infinity by 2 large mirrors on either side of the room. A child no older than 13 sits with his head dropped, his hands flat upon the table. There are 6 others here quietly singing. The child sits across from a very important lady dressed in black. Tonight, the dead Prince Albert will speak to his bereaved wife, Queen Victoria. We've happened upon the Queen's first of 9 seances with Robert James Lees. Come over here with me to these velvet curtains. Ooh, brandy. And I'll give you a little backstory. Don't worry, we'll come back to the table in a little bit. The Queen's husband died in December of 1861, and Queen Victoria was gutted by his death. I talk a lot about that in my Victorian Cult of Death episode. Victoria and Albert had participated in seances together when he was still alive, and the Queen was so into it, she actually gave a watch to one of her mediums, Georgiana Eagle, that she had inscribed, quote, "for meritorious and extraordinary clairvoyance." Shortly after Albert's death from typhoid or Crohn's disease, that's still actually up for debate, a young medium named Robert James Lees held a seance in Birmingham during which, as it's said by those who attended, he connected with Prince Albert, and the prince had a message for the Queen. A newspaper editor was one of the people, or sitters, quote-unquote, as they're called, at the seance, so the event got a lot of publicity that eventually reached the Queen herself. She wasn't a buffoon. She knew not to just accept this to be true, but her interest was piqued. So she had 2 of her courtiers attend Lee's seance and told them not to identify themselves as such and to not even give their names. In this seance, the boy's voice changed, and he began to speak with the voice of the dead prince. He turned to the men, addressed them both by name, and then discussed details of the palace which only Albert could have known, allegedly. The courtiers left the seance terrified, I'm sure, and told the queen what happened. She decided she wanted to meet with the boy in person, but before any arrangements were made, a letter arrived at the castle. It was a letter from young Lise, only it was a message from Albert that he had written while in a trance. This letter, allegedly, contained intimate details about the relationship and was signed with a pet name that the queen used for Albert. I wish I knew what that was. Signed Pookie. She nearly fainted and sent at once for Lise to hold the very seance we've joined this evening. Oh, did it just get really cold in here? Oh my, the boy is lifting his head. The queen is on bated breath. He's whispering something to her. And whatever it is that he just whispered impressed her so much that she asked Lise to be the resident medium of the household, which he refused. He said his spirit guides didn't agree that this is something he should do, but he didn't leave her without solace. The boy told her that another medium had been chosen to keep her connected to her husband. He said, "This is the boy who used to carry my gun at Balmoral." This allegedly was what he actually did say to her, and this boy was John Brown, a man many believed to be her young Scottish lover, although many other historians believed he was just a true and steadfast friend during this most terrible time of grief. And to those who were witnesses at this seance, he was also believed to be her personal medium. Okay, let's leave this room. It's freezing in here. And discuss the origins of spiritualism. The origins of spiritualism came to life in a part of upstate New York in the 1840s in an area referred to as the Burned Over District, meaning it was an area so evangelized and Christianized that there was no one there left to convert. People were very enthusiastic about their newly reformed sects of Christianity, and there were a number of them, with their own sets of spiritual and societal beliefs, such as abolition, women's rights, Native American rights, utopian social experiments, anti-Masonry, prohibition, and vegetarianism, among others. These isms fit snugly into different religious Christian-based affiliations that all lived in close proximity to one another. Quakers, Shakers, Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, and spiritualists, to name just a few. This was a region where many people, regardless of religious sect, believed that they could have direct communication with God and angels. They also believed that they had more of a say in their salvation than Protestant Christians of the past. You know how in the movie The Witch, there's this scene where Caleb anxiously asks his father if his little baby brother was in hell because he hadn't been baptized before he disappeared? The father's response reveals that these folks believed only God determines who gets saved and who doesn't. It doesn't matter what you do. You're riddled with sin, you have a corrupt nature, empty of grace, bent onto sin, only onto sin, and that continually. So your fate was basically a crapshoot. Many early Protestants believed that you could only hope to try to convince God that you were worthy by dedicating your entire life to Him. But there was nothing they could really do. God might just smite them because He wants to. These newly reformed Christians took a turn and believed that you would receive salvation if you were simply good, that all will be forgiven if you just stayed true to your faith. A man named Andrew Jackson Davis from Blooming Grove, New York, a self-identified spiritualist who identified as a mesmerist, faith healer, and clairvoyant, wrote the closest thing to a spiritualist Bible or canon in 1847 called The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelations, and a Voice to Mankind. It's fun to read. This book was supposedly dictated to a friend while Davis was in a trance. Predicting the rise of spiritualism, he said, "It is a truth that spirits commune with one another while one is in the body and the other in higher spheres. All the world will hail with delight the ushering in of that era when the interiors of men will be opened and the spiritual communication will be established." Edgar Allan Poe actually attended some of this guy's lectures, which inspired his short story, The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. In regards to Davis's specific discussions on mesmerism, a theory introduced by Franz Mesmer, that there is an invisible natural force possessed by all living things, including animals and even vegetables. It can be used for the purpose of healing, putting people into a trance, and connecting subjects with supernatural beings. This is why the word mesmerism and hypnotism sometimes are used interchangeably. Mesmerism means putting people into a trance, but among other things, that's just the connection. Up until this time, a specific example of a spiritualist proving that they could speak to the dead hadn't happened. It was just a theory that they could. However, 1 year after the writing of this canon, this book of principles, a spooky event occurred there in upstate New York in the home of the Fox family. Kate, Leah, and Margaret Fox, 3 young ladies from Hadesville, New York, reported that they had made a direct connection with a dead spirit. They claimed it was the spirit of a murdered peddler whose body was buried in the basement, and they had proof. The spirit was said to have communicated through rapping noises that a number of witnesses heard, and this was more than enough evidence for those in attendance. This was an area and a time where rampant diseases like cholera, typhoid, and influenza were inflicting unbearable physical and psychological trauma for very long periods of time. As soon as one unthinkable disease started to wane, here comes tuberculosis. People's loved ones and friends and neighbors were being ripped away in horrifying ways daily. Spiritualism was a direct response to this need to find answers and connect with those lost, and the Fox sisters' quote-unquote proof of their murdered peddler was more than enough to make people want to believe. Andrew Jackson Davis himself said he heard a voice that told him contact with a spirit had been made on the morning that the Fox girls connected with their spirit. He said, quote, "About daylight this morning, a warm breathing passed over my face, and I heard a voice, tender and strong, saying, 'Brother, the good work has begun. Behold, a living demonstration is born.'" This event got big press, and Jackson Davis wanted to be part of those stories in hopes of solidifying himself at the forefront of the spiritualist movement. So he invited the Fox sisters to his home in New York. They conducted seances in the parlor of Barnum's Hotel. Yes, that P.T. Barnum, only not him, it was his cousin's hotel. They were enthusiastically received by New York's high society, and big names attended the seances. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, James Fenimore Cooper, he's the writer of The Last of the Mohicans and many beloved stories of the day, William Cullen Bryant, American romantic poet and editor of the New York Evening Post, and abolitionist, suffragist, and civil rights activist William Lloyd Garrison, who personally witnessed a seance where spirits tapped in time to a popular song of the day and even spelled out a message, quote, "Spiritualism will work miracles in the cause of reform," end quote. One of the sisters, Leah, stayed in New York to continue seances there, but the other 2, Kate and Maggie Fox, took the show on the road. After not too long, Maggie met a gentleman in one of these seances who she eventually married, even though he thought she was a fraud. He died not too long after the wedding, leaving her penniless. She began drinking heavily and decided to convert to Catholicism and officially renounce spiritualism. Kate, meanwhile, kept the show on the road. She even conducted seances where she could communicate 2 messages simultaneously, spirit writing one message with one hand and speaking another, which is kind of impressive. She also transcribed messages in reverse. During a seance with a banker, Charles Livermore, she summoned both his dead wife and Benjamin Franklin. Her business boomed in this period and after the Civil War, which left plenty of bereaved family members desperate for one last connection. A friend of mine recently hosted a seance in his apartment in Brooklyn, which was apparently built over a Revolutionary War mass grave in Gowanus, somewhere around 3rd Ave between 7th and 8th Streets. It was a site of the Battle of Brooklyn, a slaughter at the hands of the British that George Washington unwittingly walked his troops into. According to the New York Times, of 400 soldiers, only 96 returned, with only 35 fit for duty. This friend wanted to make some contact with the soldiers to give them some recognition. I need to find out how that went. I will let you know. Back to the Fox sisters. Kate became increasingly nervous about how big spiritualism was getting. There were now millions of spiritualists in the United States, and it had spread to Europe like wildfire. Seances were getting more and more theatrical, and she was afraid she would not be able to produce the so-called miracles and apparitions that some mediums were able to produce. So like her sister, she began drinking heavily. We'll talk soon about exactly what those miracles entailed. On October 21st, 1888, the New York World newspaper published a bombshell that Maggie Fox was paid $1,500 to provide. Maggie was the one who converted to Catholicism and denounced spiritualism. She gave a press conference and said, quote, "My sister Katie and myself were very young children when this horrible deception began. At night, when we went to bed, we used to tie an apple on a string and move the string up and down, causing the apple to bump on the floor, or we would drop the apple on the floor, making a strange noise every time it would rebound." End quote. The bouncing apple on a string was what she said was used to create the rapping of the dead peddler in their basement. She blamed the other sister, Leah, for taking advantage of her and her other sister as children, forcing them to go along with this big lie. She continued, quote, "A great many people, when they hear the rapping, imagine once that the spirits are touching them. It is a very common delusion. Some very wealthy people came to see me some years ago when I lived in 42nd Street, and I did some rappings for them. I made the spirit rap on the chair, and one of the ladies cried out, 'I feel the spirit tapping me on the shoulder.' Of course, that was pure imagination." End quote. She said that she and her sisters then moved on to cracking their knuckles and toes to create rapping sounds. She also did a demonstration. She removed her shoe and placed her right foot on a wooden stool. The New York Herald described this demonstration like this, quote, "There stood a black-robed, sharp-faced widow working her big toe and solemnly declaring that it was in this way that she created the excitement that has driven so many persons to suicide or insanity. One moment it was ludicrous, the next it was weird." End quote. That is hilarious. After blaming Leah for all of this again, saying it was all her idea, she thanked God that she was able to expose spiritualism as nothing but hokum. That was not a direct quote. This explosive event shook the movement to its core, though many remained unshaken and fully devoted, either claiming that Maggie was never a real medium anyway, or that she was indeed a medium and her spirit guides had been, quote, "usurped by other unseen intelligences who are not scrupulous in their dealings with humanity." End quote. That was a quote from the spirit of Samuel B. Britton, the dead former publisher of the Spiritual Telegraph, who showed up in a seance after this occurred. He just wanted to get the record straight. Years later, Maggie actually recounted this confession, but that just infuriated spiritualists who felt she destroyed the respectability of the movement. In the 1890s, the three Fox sisters died, Leah dying of alcohol abuse. Interestingly, though, years later, in 1904, children playing in the original old broken-down home of the Fox sisters discovered, you guessed it, a skeleton between the dirt and crumbling walls. Was this the murdered peddler there all along? The bones were examined by a doctor who concluded that the skeleton had like 3 ribs, a number of pelvises, and a couple of chicken bones. The skeleton was clearly placed there by some trickster who had access to human bones. That's a bit wait a minute. What a way to get rid of a body, right? Like, if you needed to get rid of a couple of bones, that would be an ingenious way to do it. Like, put them somewhere where people would think they're a murdered old peddler and toss some chicken bones in there to really throw them off the scent. Oh, that's horrible, Genevieve. All right, let's talk a bit about exactly what a materializing seance would entail. This was a specific seance where something or someone would be materialized, specifically ectoplasm, or a full torso free-roaming vapor that would either float through the room or even appear in photography. If you've seen the movie A Haunting in Connecticut, there's like a flashback scene where a boy at a seance emits ectoplasm that floats in the air that looks kind of like entrails and appears to catch fire and explode. I actually like that movie. Although when most of us hear the word ectoplasm, we usually think of the green goo in Ghostbusters. But that supernatural, slop was based on historical accounts of what this stuff was supposed to look like and feel like. It could actually look like a lot of things, but mostly it came in the form of goo. Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, described ectoplasm as a viscous, gelatinous substance which appeared to differ from every known form of matter in that it could solidify and be used for material purposes. End quote. A detailed description of another form of ectoplasm from L. Ann Delgado for the University of Colorado in Boulder states that ectoplasm can even take shapes like flowers, faces, or entire spirits. It can also appear as what some describe as sticky webs. During a materializing seance, a medium would go into a trance, and this goo would pour out of their eyes, ears, mouth, and private parts, including boobs. Fascinating. At a materializing seance in a dark room lit only by candles, folks were encouraged to sit around a table, alternating male and female, join hands, and quietly sing hymns until the medium fell into this gooey trance. Sometimes a medium would go into their own spirit cabinet first. This was an upright piece of furniture that they'd nestle into and close the door. At other times, they'd stand behind curtains and wait to fall into their trances. Some full-torso free-roaming ectoplasm vapor spirits would move around the room, bumping into furniture. And sometimes, after the medium oozed, they would embody the contacted spirit themselves, convulsing, screaming, or falling asleep. A medium by the name of Helen Duncan was known for popping into her spirit cabinet and oozing ectoplasm that would take the shapes of spirits. She was said to excrete an entire 12 feet of ectoplasm in one instance. She was often visited by a particular spirit named Peggy, the little dead girl of a client who swore she saw the shape of her daughter in the ectoplasm. Mrs. Duncan would continue to include little Peggy in her other seances, appearing to be possessed by the little girl, and would sing and dance for the sitters. How fucking creepy is that? A medium's assistant would also snap a photo during a seance, which, when developed, would show the latent image of a spooky ghost. What was really going on in all of these instances, any which included oozing or spirits showing up in photography or performing vaudeville acts through the bodies of the medium, is that they were lying. Believe it or not, Mrs. Duncan's ectoplasm, for example, was examined and found to be nothing but cheap fabric, like cheesecloth or cotton gauze, and when these mediums would ooze this, it was just regurgitation. The pictures of some of these mediums with clearly just rolled up fabric with faces drawn on them is just hilarious. Harry Houdini, who was a fervent skeptic of mediums, explained how to do the ectoplasm trick. They would simply tightly wad up a ton of this fabric and puke it up in a controlled manner. They would also simply stuff it up their noses and in one strong out-breath blow it out their noses. The spirit cabinets were also obviously there to conceal themselves while they maybe shoved something somewhere to fall out of something when the cabinet door was opened again. They could even make elaborate shapes out of it behind the door, sometimes in the shape of a spirit or something. Spirit photography was made through a trick of double exposure. I heard a theory that the reason why we think of ghosts as these transparent, floating forms is because of double exposure spirit photography. There are examples of dead spirits taking similar forms to this before spirit photography became a thing. But these photographs really solidify this particular incarnation in the minds of society, as opposed to the solid forms of ghosts with chains like in Dickens' Christmas Carol. Remember how I mentioned the ectoplasm in that movie, A Haunting in Connecticut, looked kind of like entrails? That's probably because the design may have been inspired by the animal intestines that other mediums would get creative with to produce as their ectoplasm. They would also use glowing paint, no doubt made from radium, to make handprints on the tables. They would have assistants hidden behind curtains, creating smoke and mirror effects. And they would also use seduction and sexuality in their performances. Most mediums were women, and this was a time when women didn't have much control over their own lives, finances, or bodies, as if we do now. Claiming to be a medium was big business, and some of these ladies really knew how to work a crowd to get some press. Florence Cook, a teenage medium, would manifest flirtatious spirits that would tease, touch, and even kiss people at the seance, and ask them to put their hands on her. French medium Eva Carrere literally invited an audience member to give her a gynecological exam to prove that she had nothing hidden up there. She was known for performing seances nude and pulling elaborate ectoplasm sculptures out of her vagina. Heavens. I can see how this would be a very exciting, empowering act for women in this time, where they were supposed to be demure, speak when spoken to, lock themselves in suffocating corsets, and instead they got to put their fabulous bodies on display, be the center of attention, command a room, and charge a pretty penny for it. It's a shame they were liars, manipulating grieving people out of their money, but nevertheless, it must have been a thrilling experience for everyone involved. Let's now talk briefly about the invention of the talking board, otherwise known as the Ouija board. In 1886, an article was written in the Associated Press about an alternative to asking spirits for knocks, light flickers, or the drawn-out process of a medium becoming possessed by a spirit. It was called a talking board or a spirit board. Some mediums were starting to use a board with numbers and letters with a yes and a no written on them, with a little device that the spirit would use to move around, making communication with the dead far more streamlined and clear. It didn't take too long for someone to realize they could be making money off of these things, and a gentleman named Charles Kennard decided to team up with a few friends and start a company to produce them. Neither Charles nor these other friends were spiritualists, but one of them had a sister-in-law who was known to be a powerful medium. When a discussion arose about what to name the board, Miss Helen Peters decided to ask it herself. It's not true that Ouija is just French and German for yes. When she asked the board what it wanted to be called, the planchette moved. That's the little piece that you place your fingers on ever so lightly. It spelled out the letters O-U-I-J-A, and when Helen asked what it meant, the board said it meant good luck. So they had a name. Now they needed a patent, and this is really interesting. They brought the board to a patent office, but the patent officers thought it was some kind of a joke. One decided to talk to them, though, and said he'd issue a patent only if they could prove that it worked. Specifically, it would have to spell out his last name. The guys didn't know the man, and they didn't even really truly believe it could contact dead spirits themselves, despite Helen's naming ritual. But they gave it a shot anyway. They laid their board down, they placed their fingers on the edge of the planchette ever so lightly, and it did exactly what he asked. It spelled out his last name. The officer, wide-eyed and terrified, told the men, quote, "You've got your patent," as he left the room. Or so the story goes. Even though the board made the Kennard family and Helen Peters a lot of money, it caused a great deal of drama in the Peters household. Okay, this next bit is really weird. Helen and her sister used to go out onto battlefields when they were little and pull the buttons off of dead Civil War soldiers' coats and saved them in a treasured family collection. That is an insane bit of information. And one day, the collection went missing. She asked the board where it had gone, and it told her that a certain family member had stolen it. Half the family believed it. She said it was lying and refused to believe it, and this whole affair tore her whole family apart. The dead Civil War soldier button collection was never found. She died in 1940, and her gravestone is really neat. In big cursive letters, it says, "Helen Peters Noseworthy, the woman who named the Ouija board." There's a big smiling sun and two hands with Ouija board letters and a planchette engraved on the stone. It's really quite pretty. I'll add a picture of that with a few other pictures from today's episode on Instagram at My Victorian Nightmare. Before we go, remember how I said Houdini was a big skeptic? He even spent a lot of time proving mediums to be frauds, and even showed how they performed their tricks. Despite this, he told his wife that if she wanted to try a seance herself to contact his spirit after death, he'd use a code. The code was Rosabelle Believe. She held seances on Halloween night every year for 10 years, but never received the code from a medium during a seance. But a few years later, after she gave up on the seances altogether, a medium, Arthur Ford, claimed to know the code, and Bess Houdini signed a statement that he did in fact tell her exactly what that secret code was. But a scandal erupted after this because by this time she had told the code to some personal friends, and it was revealed partially in a biography about Houdini. So in the end, she recanted her statement and distanced herself from the whole spiritualist movement. But some believe that Arthur Ford really did know the code, because again, it was only partially written and he had never met Bess Houdini before. Whether he got the info from one of her friends, no one knows. I would just like to believe that Houdini really did try to get in contact, because I, like a lot of people, despite all of the charlatans and frauds and crooks and fakes, would still like to believe that we can connect with the folks who've moved on somehow. Maybe not through vagina sculptures, but like other ways, like dreams, or just talking to them directly, even if you get no response at all. I will leave you with something pretty special, a bit of the recording of the audio from Houdini's last seance. Listen to this.
Oh, thou disembodied spirits, those of you that have grown old in the mysterious laws of spirit land, we greet thee. We have gathered here at the appointed time. We have complied with all the requirements to enable all of you to make your presence known. Members of the spirit world have long known of the intention of this important gathering tonight. All is in readiness. Please now, the time is at hand. Make yourself known to us. Any of you, please, manifest yourself in any way possible. Please let your united strength and knowledge aid Houdini in coming through. It is the spirit of Houdini we wish to contact. Houdini, are you here? Are you here, Houdini? Please manifest yourself in any way possible. Take from this earnest gathering any strength that may be necessary for you to use. Take any vital thing from us that you may need to enable you to carry out your promise of years ago. We have waited, Houdini, oh so long. Never have you been able to present the evidence you promised. And now, this is a night of night. The world is listening. Harry, your world, your audience. And Bessie is here. Your Bessie, who is part of you for 33 years. She's here, Harry, pleading in her heart for a prearranged sign from you. It means so much to her, to all of us, to the world.
Again, that wasn't the full seance. It's considerably longer, but you can find the full thing on YouTube if you want to. Just search for Houdini's Last Seance. Thank you so much again for listening, and if you enjoy this podcast and would like to hear more, rate, review, and subscribe. Be kind to yourselves, and I will see you in your nightmares.